Close your eyes and let the edges of the room disappear. Tonight, we aren't just moving through time. We are dissolving into it, following the path of a girl named Sophie, who stepped into the freezing winds of the East to become something the world would never forget. Catherine. Before the palaces rise from the mist, feel the weight of your day lifting. As you settle into your blankets, let the hum of the world fade. If you find peace in these journeys, a quiet nod to the subscribe button helps keep this sanctuary alive for others seeking rest. But for now, your only task is to exist in this stillness. We are going to a place of iron and enlightenment. But first, we must find the silence between the heartbeats of history. Welcome to this quiet space where the heavy weight of the modern world begins to soften and fade away. Imagine the air around you becoming still, cool, and perfectly calm as we prepare to drift back through the long, velvet corridors of time. Before we begin our journey into the archives of the past, take a moment to ensure your surroundings are exactly as they should be. Reach out and dim the lamps until the room is bathed in a gentle amber glow, or perhaps extinguish the lights entirely, letting the natural shadows of the evening cradle the corners of your vision. If you find comfort in a soft, steady hum, now is the time to turn on a fan or a white noise machine, creating a consistent anchor for your senses. Adjust your pillow, pull the covers a little higher, and allow your shoulders to drop away from your ears. There is nothing left for you to do today, no problems to solve, and no deadlines to meet. You are safe here, tucked away in this pocket of stillness, ready to listen to a story that has been waiting centuries to be told. Tonight, we step into a narrative of profound transformation and quiet ambition. We are exploring the life of a young woman born Sophie Friederike August, a minor German princess who arrived in a foreign land with nothing but her intellect and a hidden fire of determination. Through patience, study, and a series of calculated risks, she would eventually cast aside her old identity to become Catherine the Empress, who would redefine the boundaries of Russia and the reach of the Enlightenment. Her story is one of sharp intellect and sweeping reforms, but also a study in how a focused mind can navigate the most treacherous of waters to claim a destiny that no one else had imagined for her. As the cadence of my voice settles into a steady rhythmic flow, allow your mind to become loose and wandering. You do not need to lean in to catch every detail or memorize every date. Let the historical images form behind your closed eyes, like ink spreading slowly through water, soft and blurred at the edges. Sometimes our stories are too interesting, but tonight we let the details wash over you like a slow-moving tide. If your thoughts begin to drift toward sleep, let them go. The history will remain here, a gentle companion to your rest, rising and falling like a distant ocean. We begin our journey far from the gilded palaces of St. Petersburg, in a much quieter place. Visualize the modest, drafty halls of a small German principality in the Holy Roman Empire. There is a chill in the air, the smell of beeswax candles, and the sound of a quill scratching against parchment. A young girl is looking out a window at a world that feels far too small for the thoughts beginning to bloom in her mind. This is where the seed of an empire was first planted, in the quiet, forgotten corners of a minor court. Long ago, before the heavy names of empires were etched into the stone of history, and long before the weight of gold crowns pressed upon her brow, there was only a quiet silver corner of the Holy Roman Empire. The world was different then, slower, lit by the flickering reach of beeswax, and governed by the steady, rhythmic ticking of grandfather clocks in drafty stone hallways. On May 2nd, 1729, In the city of Stettin, a girl was born who would one day command the sun to rise over the Balt. But for now she was simply Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst Dornberg. The world she entered was not one of overwhelming grandeur or infinite, unchecked power. Instead, it was a world of quiet, modest nobility, a place where titles were grander than the bank accounts that supported them. Her family were minor German aristocrats, well connected, respected, but living in a state of carefully managed comfort rather than the vast, gold-leafed opulence we often associate with royalty. Imagine a house where every piece of furniture is polished until it shines, not because it is new, but because it must last for generations. Her father, Christian August, was a disciplined Prussian officer, a man of rigid duty and clockwork order, whose life was measured in military drills and the cold, clean scent of iron and starch. In contrast, her mother, Joanna Elizabeth, was a woman of sharp tongue and even sharper ambition, a woman whose mind was a chessboard of marriage alliances and social maneuvers. Joanna spent her days dreaming of elevating the family's status, weaving a complex web of connections that might one day pull them from the gray obscurity of their quiet province. She looked at her daughter not just as a child, but as a vessel for the family's future, a precious piece to be moved carefully across the map of Europe. As you settle deeper into your blankets, let your mind wander into the stillness of those German halls. The air in Zerbst was always a little cool, carrying the faint, dry scent of old library books, vellum, and the slow, heavy smoke of wood fires burning in distant hearths. Even as a small child, Sophie was acutely aware of the atmosphere around her. She sensed the hunger for social climbing that vibrated through her household like a low-frequency hum. She was not a child of loud play or fleeting distractions. She was unusually poised, intellectually curious, and obsessed with the quiet, solitary act of learning. While other children might have been occupied with the trivialities of the court, Sophie was often found tucked away in a corner, devouring books with a hunger that matched her mother's ambition. Watching the behavior of adults with a hawk-like focus that missed nothing. Visualize the young Sophie, sitting by a tall, narrow window as the pale gray light of a Prussian afternoon begins to fade into the indigo of twilight. Her world was physically small, bounded by the thick stone walls of the castle of Zerbst, but her mind was already wandering far beyond those cold, familiar halls. She was a girl who understood, perhaps too early, the immense power found in silence and the critical importance of observation. She watched how people spoke, how they tilted their heads when they lied, and how they hid their true intentions behind the stiff, polite smiles of the provincial elite. She was being molded, not just by her mother's relentless coaching, but by her own internal, unyielding drive to understand the hidden mechanics of the world. In this quiet, early life, there were no whispers of a grand destiny. No one in Germany looked at this young, serious girl and saw an empress of all the Russias. To the world, she was a pawn, a daughter to be married off to secure a border or a title. Yet, beneath that quiet, obedient exterior, a massive and restless intellect was taking shape. She read philosophy, history, and poetry, seeking out the thoughts of the Enlightenment's great minds to fill the vast empty spaces where her own future felt uncertain. The smell of ink and the tactile sensation of rough paper became her sanctuary, a private empire where she could rule her own thoughts with absolute authority. Even if she ruled nothing else in the physical world, feel the heavy, dust-moted velvet curtains of the library as they muffle the sounds of the outside world, creating a cocoon of perfect safety. Here, Sophie is protected. She is a student of human nature. quiet observer of the grand chess match of European politics that played out in the letters her mother received. Her mother often called her too serious, and the local courtiers found her too quiet, perhaps even a bit dull. But they did not see the hawk-like intensity burning behind her steady eyes. They did not know that she was already learning the art of erasing, herself erasing any trace of resistance, any flicker of stubbornness, preparing her spirit for a life of total, radical adaptation. She was learning to wield her intelligence like a concealed blade, hidden perfectly beneath a cloak of modest grace and charming compliance. The days in the German provinces moved with a slow, predictable grace, marked by the turning of the leaves from green to gold and the steady, unhurried rhythm of a minor courtly life. But in the winter of her 14th year, the unexpected happened. A letter arrived that would shatter the stillness of her childhood like a stone through thin ice. Empress Elizabeth of Russia, the formidable and childless ruler of a vast, mysterious land, had chosen a successor, her nephew, Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. But Peter was a fragile, difficult man who needed a bride, a girl who could be easily molded, someone who came from a respectable family but possessed no power of her own to challenge the Russian throne. Sophie was the perfect candidate in a single heartbeat. Her world underwent a violent shift. The quiet library, the comforting smell of old books, and the familiar gray Prussian skies were suddenly replaced by the promise of something immense, terrifying, and undeniably grand. She was to leave everything she had ever known, her home, her childhood friends, her Lutherly faith, and eventually, even the name Sophie itself. She was being called to travel toward the vast, cold empire of the East, a land that existed in the European mind as a place of infinite snow and ancient, inscrutable power. As she prepared for the long journey, Sophie looked one last time at the modest, drafty halls of her youth. She knew, with a clarity that few 14-year-olds possess, that she would never return to this place as the person she was now. She was stepping out of the safe, predictable shadows of a minor German court and into the blinding, freezing light of a destiny she was determined to claim, no matter the cost to her soul. The carriage was waiting in the courtyard, its iron-rimmed wheels resting on the frozen ground, ready to carry her across the border into a world where the only rule was survival. Imagine the sound of the horse's breath, huffing in the cold morning air, a rhythmic, misting sound that signaled the end of her quiet life. Behind her lay the library and the safety of the known. Before her lay thousands of miles of frozen road, leading toward a throne that sat at the very edge of the world. As the carriage began to move, the swaying motion became a lullaby, a steady vibration that whispered of the long, cold winter that was about to begin. She closed her eyes, letting the memory of her German home fade into the distance, replaced by the rising image of a city built on a marsh, where the wind smells of salt and the future is written in the snow. The heavy iron-rimmed wheels of the carriage finally crossed the invisible line that marked the border of the Russian Empire, and in that moment, the very essence of the world seemed to shift. The air traveling through the small gaps in the window frame became thicker, carrying the sharp, medicinal scent of ancient pine needles, the deep musk of damp earth, and a cold so absolute, so piercing, that it felt like a physical weight pressing against the skin. Russia was not merely another country to the young, wide-eyed Sophie. It was an empire of staggering proportions, a land of deep, unsearchable mysteries, and ancient Orthodox traditions that felt like a distant, echoing chant compared to the tidy, predictable Lutheran streets of her German youth. As she gazed out at the endless, white horizon, a sea of snow, broken only by the skeletal white trunks of birch trees, She realized with a startling clarity that to survive in this vastness, she could not simply be a visitor passing through. She had to be reborn. The journey toward the heart of the empire was long and physically exhausting. A rhythmic, hypnotic swaying through landscapes that seemed to stretch into the very edge of eternity. But with every mile of frozen road, the girl she had been in the quiet halls of Zerbst began to fade, dissolving into the mist of the past, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve that burned like a low flame in the center of her chest. Upon her arrival in the glittering yet treacherous court of St. Petersburg, Sophie, now named Catherine Alexeyevna, did not hesitate for a single second to begin the radical, meticulous process of erasing her German identity. She understood, with a maturity that far outstripped her 14 years, that her past was no longer an asset. It was a liability, a shadow she had to outrun. Her entire future depended on her ability to become more Russian than the Russians themselves, to weave herself into the very fabric of the nation, until no one could remember she had ever been a foreigner. She threw herself into the study of the Russian language with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Imagine her in the late hours of the night, long after the court had finished its dancing and its wine, pacing the floor of her bedchamber by the flickering light of a single candle. She would repeat the strange, beautiful phonetics of the Slavic tongue over and over, feeling the way the sounds vibrated in her throat, until her tongue moved with the same fluid, liquid grace as a native speaker. She pushed her body to the brink of exhaustion, practicing her prayers and her grammar while the rest of the world slept, driven by the knowledge that language was the first and most important key to the heart of her new subjects. Her conversion to the Orthodox faith was not merely a political requirement. It was a public shedding of her old self, a symbolic death and resurrection. When she stood in the incense-filled cathedrals, surrounded by the golden icons and the deep, resonant bass of the monks chanting, she was not just performing a ritual. She was absorbing the soul of the empire. She adapted her movements, her gaze, and even her style of dress to align perfectly with the expectations of the powerful Empress Elizabeth and the Russian people. While other courtiers were content with the shallow, glittering surface of palace life, Catherine was diving into the deep currents of the nation's history, reshaping her mind and her habits to become a vessel for the Russian spirit. However, as the external masks of her life were perfected, the internal reality of her marriage began to settle like a layer of heavy, suffocating frost. Her husband, Peter of Holstein-Gottorp, was no prince from the romantic stories she had devoured in her youth. As she observed him day after day, with her characteristic, hawk-like focus, Catherine came to a cold and devastatingly clear realization. Peter was a boy trapped in a man's body, a soul that had refused to grow in proportion to his power. He was immature, awkward, and emotionally stunted, possessing none of the gravity required for a future Tsar. She watched him with a mixture of pity and growing dread as he spent his hours marching elaborate collections of toy soldiers across mahogany tabletops, his eyes alight with a childish, manic glee that had no place in the high-stakes corridors of an imperial palace. He was more concerned with the precision of a miniature parade than with the desperate complexities of the empire he was destined to lead. And in those silent observational moments, the last flickering dreams of a young bride died. They were replaced by the chilling, crystalline clarity of a political survivor who understood that, in the grand frozen theater of the Russian court, she was effectively alone in a den of wolves. Despite the profound loneliness of her position, Catherine moved through the halls of the Winter Palace with a quiet, almost hypnotic precision. She learned the art of the perfect practiced smile a gesture that reached her lips, but was carefully guarded in her eyes, masking the lightning-fast calculations spinning behind her calm exterior. She dressed with a restrained, intelligent elegance, becoming a master of the visual language of the court. She was always present at the banquets and the balls, a silent, graceful shadow that everyone noticed but no one truly feared, for she made herself appear exactly as they wished to see her, dutiful, quiet, and submissive. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and inherently calming to those around her, hiding the fact that her mind was a recording device, studying every courtier's weakness, every spy's rhythm, and every subtle shift in the wind of imperial favor. The palace was a labyrinth of whispers, a place where alliances shifted like shadows on a sunlit wall, and where a single poorly timed word could mean immediate exile or a quiet disappearance. Catherine lived in a state of constant, low-level vigilance, yet she projected an aura of total, unshakable serenity. She became an expert in the politics of survival, learning when to speak, and perhaps more importantly, when to utilize the heavy weight of silence. Even when her health faltered under the stress, and rumors began to circulate that Peter resented her very existence, whispers that he withheld medicine, or hoped for her end, she remained composed, recovering from near-fatal illnesses with a renewed, sharpened sense of purpose. She was building a hidden sanctuary within herself, a carefully constructed fortress that protected her true spirit from the treacherous, freezing currents of the court. As the years drifted by, like slow-moving clouds across a winter sky, and her marriage grew increasingly hollow, a mere shell of a union, Catherine found that the physical world of the palace was no longer enough to sustain the fire in her mind. The toy soldiers, the empty ceremonies, and the repetitive gossip of the court felt like a gilded cage. To keep her soul from flickering out, she began to retreat into a secret life of the mind, a hidden intellectual world built of ink, parchment, and the dangerous, intoxicating ideas of the Western Enlightenment. Beneath the silken down of her pillows, she hid books by Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire, texts that spoke of liberty, the social contract, and the true, rational nature of power. While the rest of the palace played at power, Catherine was studying its blueprint, preparing for a future that was still hidden behind the dark horizon of a long Russian night, waiting for the moment when the shadows would finally give way to the dawn of her own ray. The long, icy winter of Catherine's shadow life, a period of nearly 18 years spent in the cold, watchful silence of the Russian court, finally reached its atmospheric end in 1762. This was a year when the quiet whispers of the palace corridors shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, into the deep, deafening roar of history. When Empress Elizabeth finally passed away, the crown moved to her nephew, Peter III, but the man who ascended the throne was as erratic, unpredictable, and unstable as the thawing, jagged ice of a Russian spring. For nearly 2 Catherine had waited in the profound silence of her own ambition, reading her books by candlelight, learning the intricate steps of the political dance, and observing the deep, structural fractures in her husband's character. Now, as the sun rose on a new reign, those fractures were becoming deep, irreparable chasms that threatened to swallow the entire empire. Peter III did not possess the soul of a czar. He possessed the heart of a frightened, displaced foreigner who deeply resented the very land and people he was now meant to rule. In just a few short, chaotic months of his reign, he managed to systematically alienate every essential pillar of Russian society, from the deeply traditional and powerful Russian Orthodox Church to the proud, iron-willed military regiments that formed the backbone of the state. Visualize the tension, thick and heavy like the humid summer air of a St. Petersburg afternoon. Peter had insulted the ancient clergy, mocked the sacred Russian traditions that held the common people together, and, in an act that felt like a direct betrayal to the very soul of the nation, he withdrew victorious Russian troops from a war against Prussia. He was handing back the hard-won spoils of war to Frederick the Great, a man he idolized, but who was, in the eyes of the Russian soldiers, the enemy they had bled to defeat. The military, especially the elite Imperial Guard, watched in a simmering, quiet fury as their sacrifices were discarded by a man who seemed more loyal to a foreign king than to his own imperial subject. Catherine, ever the silent and patient strategist, watched these ripples of resentment from her residence at the coastal palace of Peterhof. She knew that the time for quiet observation had passed, and the moment for a definitive historical pivot had arrived. She had already begun the delicate work of nurturing a quiet, invisible network of loyalists, men of steel, intelligence, and vast influence who saw in her the leader that Peter could never hope to be. Among them was Grigory Orlov, a daring, charismatic military officer, and Catherine's personal lover, who held the vital keys to the loyalty and the hearts of the Imperial Guard. Orlov was not merely a romantic partner. He was the primary engine of her rising ambition. A man who moved through the smoke-filled barracks whispering her name like a prayer for a better, more stable future. Behind the heavy gilded palace walls, Catherine made silent promises and secured solemn blood oaths. She had no legal claim to the throne of Russia, no drop of ancient Russian blood flowing in her German veins. But she possessed something far more potent and dangerous than a simple birthright. She had the absolute, unwavering confidence of those who held the swords. On the morning of June 28, 1762, as the first, pale light of dawn touched the golden spires of the city, the long shadows of her life finally turned into the solid wood of a throne. With Peter distracted and isolated at a distant palace, unaware that the world was moving beneath his feet, Catherine made her move. Imagine her not in the soft, restrictive silk gowns of a neglected wife, but dressed in the crisp, green military uniform of the guards, sitting astride a powerful white horse with her hair flowing freely in the cool Baltic wind. She rode directly to the Izmailovsky regiment barracks, standing before a vast sea of soldiers with a calm, hypnotic, and commanding presence that brooked no hesitation or doubt. There, in the crisp, salt-scented morning air, she declared herself the sovereign and sole ruler of Russia. The response was instantaneous, a massive, rhythmic wave of silver and steel, as the soldiers pledged their lives and their loyalty to her on the spot. The transition that followed was as smooth and deliberate as a practiced pivot in a grand imperial dance. One by one, the gods, the high-ranking nobles, and even the senior clergy of the church followed her lead, recognizing that the winds of history had finally shifted in her direction. Catherine rode through the cobbled streets of St. Petersburg in full imperial regalia, her face a mask of serene, unshakable authority. The people did not rise against her in a chaotic frenzy of anger. Instead, they welcomed her with a sense of profound, collective relief, seeing in her a ruler who finally understood the heavy, sacred weight of the crown. Peter, broken, confused, and suddenly powerless, fled into the gathering darkness, and within a few short days, he was forced to abdicate his throne and his life's work entirely. Soon after, he was dead murdered under suspicious, shadowed circumstances, likely by the hands of Catherine's most devoted ally. She never publicly admitted to ordering the act, nor did she ever deny that his convenient death made her position on the throne absolutely secure. She simply remarked to her journals that he was no longer needed for the future of the empire. It was a nearly bloodless coup, a perfectly executed quiet maneuver that avoided the messy chaos of a civil war or a mass, violent uprising. A foreign-born woman, without a single drop of Russian blood, had seized the throne of one of the world's largest and most traditional empires through sheer force of will and the careful, decade-long cultivation of her public image. The unthinkable had been achieved. She was no longer a pawn in the games of kings. She was the queen, the empress, and the autocrat of all the Russia. As the echoes of the soldiers' cheers faded into the evening mist, and the heavy, diamond-encrusted weight of the crown was finally placed upon her head, Catherine knew that the most difficult chapter was only just beginning. Seizing the throne had been an act of extreme daring, a moment of brilliant light in a life of shadows. But keeping it would require a lifetime of sustained intellectual genius. She had claimed the title. Now she had to prove she deserved the power. Every decision she made from this moment forward would be an attempt to earn the crown she had stolen, transforming herself from a revolutionary usurper into a visionary reformer. The pivot was complete, and the stage was set for a reign that would change the world. But first, she had to navigate the complex reality of a nation that was still waking up to its new leader. Once the heavy, diamond-encrusted crown was firmly hers, Catherine did not simply rest upon the velvet of her throne. She began a profound, lifelong transformation of herself and her empire. She understood with a chilling, brilliant clarity that true power was not merely a matter of military control or ancient bloodline, but a carefully, meticulously crafted image of a ruler destined for greatness. To the watching eyes of the world, and especially to the intellectual salons of Europe, she began to style herself as a philosopher on the throne, a modern monarch who ruled not by divine right alone, but by the steady, unwavering light of human reason. In the quiet, hollow hours of the late evening, away from the exhausting noise and the perfumed intrigue of the court, she maintained a prolific, intimate correspondence with the greatest minds of her age. Imagine her, sitting at a desk of dark, polished wood, the only sound the soft scratching of a quill as she exchanged long, witty, and deeply philosophical letters with Voltaire, Diderot, and other luminaries of the Enlightenment. To these distant thinkers, she was living, breathing proof that enlightened ideas could indeed shape the destiny of a vast empire, and they hailed her in return as a visionary, a Semiramis of the North who was bringing civilization to the wilderness. Behind this elegant intellectual facade, however, Catherine was a tireless, unyielding modernizer. She spent her days working to scrub the Russian bureaucracy of its ancient, encrusted corruption and to improve the education and lives of her millions of subjects. She personally authored the nakaz, or the instruction, a bold and profoundly radical document inspired by the greatest legal minds of the Enlightenment. In its pages, she dared to criticize the use of torture, advocated for a more rational legal system, and emphasized the revolutionary idea of equality before the law. She dreamed of a Russia governed by laws that were fair, rational, and humane, a nation that moved in rhythm with the progress of the Western world. Yet, Catherine was also a profound realist, a woman who understood the heavy, immovable weight of Russian tradition and the immense power of the land-owning nobility. When she convened a massive commission to enact these reforms, she met with fierce, stubborn resistance from those who were unwilling to relinquish a single drop of their ancient privileges. Ever the patient strategist, she stepped back from her most radical ideals rather than risk the chaos of a civil war. She shelved many of her grandest reforms, tucking them away like precious silk in a drawer, but she never abandoned the powerful, radiant image of herself as the empire's great reformer. Beneath the soft silk of her philosophical speeches and her witty letters, there was always a hand made of cold, unyielding iron. While she spoke the elevated language of liberty and justice to her friends in the salons of Paris, she governed the vastness of Russia with an unmatched and absolute authority. She walked a delicate, dangerous tightrope between progress and preservation, ensuring that every ideal she championed served the ultimate singular goal of strengthening her own sovereign power. She was a monarch first, and a philosopher second, when the violent fires of the French Revolution finally erupted in 1789. The empress, who had once embraced the ideas of liberty, suddenly saw them as nothing more than dangerous, chaotic sparks. She banned revolutionary texts, tightened the grip of censorship, and grew suspicious of the very minds she had once praised, proving that her commitment to the Enlightenment had a definitive expiration date when it threatened the stability and safety of her throne. There was a soothing, rhythmic quality to the way she expanded the empire's influence and borders. Under her steady, focused guidance, St. Petersburg was transformed into a blinding beacon of European culture, filled with new theaters, vast libraries, and magnificent museums that housed the treasures of the world. She poured the empire's resources into the arts and the sciences, founding the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, Russia's first state-funded school for women, to ensure that the next generation was as educated and intellectually sharp as she was herself. While the physical borders of the empire moved steadily outward, stretching hungrily into the south, toward the warm waters of the Black Sea, and pushing west into the fractured heart of Poland, Catherine presented these vast conquests not as simple imperial aggression, but as the inevitable, noble advance of civilization itself. Through a master class in cunning strategy and diplomatic elegance, she added millions of new subjects and hundreds of thousands of square miles to the Russian map, creating a legacy that would be discussed for centuries. She modernized the administration, making it more centralized, more capable, and far more respected on the world stage than it had ever been before. She had proven beyond any doubt that a woman could not only lead a sprawling autocratic empire, but could beat the most powerful men of her age at their own game of geopolitical chess. Every letter she penned and every school she founded was a carefully placed brick in the enduring monument of her name. But history is a complex tapestry of many overlapping threads, and even as the brilliant image of the enlightened empress solidified in the halls of Europe, another story was beginning to take shape in the distant, humid shadows of a different continent. While Catherine was building her empire of solid stone and rational law, other men, far across the ocean, were being consumed by a vastly different kind of ambition. History, it seems, has another face, one not made of cold, rational philosophy or the quiet scratching of a quill, but one made of shimmering gold and the fevered, desperate dreams of the uncharted jungle. As we leave the gilded palaces of Russia behind, we begin to hear the sound of the wind through the rainforest, whispering of a treasure that was never meant to be found. The transition from the cold, structured intellect of the Russian court to the humid, fevered dreams of the South American jungle is as stark and profound as the shift from a pale, distant moon to the flickering, smoky light of a guttering torch. As the sharp, disciplined image of Catherine's iron-willed empire begins to fade into a quiet, blue-gray mist of memory, we find ourselves standing on an entirely different kind of precipice. Here, the air is no longer thin and sharp with the scent of northern frost. Instead, it becomes heavy, fragrant with the smell of damp earth, crushed ferns, and the ancient, unsearchable secrets of a world that existed long before the first stone of St. Day. Petersburg was laid long before the name El Dorado became a word synonymous with a lost city of shimmering walls and streets paved in impossible treasure. It was something far more intimate, far more human, and far more sacred. It was not a place to be found on a map, but a man and a king, a living vessel of the divine, whose physical body served as the only bridge between the dusty earth and the eternal gods of the sky. In the high green emerald valleys of what is now central Colombia, the indigenous Muisca people lived in a world where gold was never a currency of greed or a measure of commerce, but a profound language of spiritual reverence. To them, gold was the very sweat of the sun, a celestial material that captured and held the eternal light of the heavens within its soft, yellow weight. Visualize a sacred ceremony held at the very edge of Lake Guatavita, an almost perfectly circular crater lake nestled like a dark, unblinking jewel within the silent, mist-covered highlands of the Andes. The water is unnaturally still, a dark mirror reflecting the first pale, golden rays of the rising sun as they crest the jagged mountain ridges. There, amidst the low, rhythmic chanting of the priests and the resonant, vibrating thrum of traditional instruments, a new chieftain would prepare for the most important moment of his life. He was stripped bare of all worldly garments, his skin anointed with sticky, fragrant resins, and then meticulously covered from head to toe in fine, shimmering gold dust until he became El Hombre Dura, the Golden Man. He would step onto a ceremonial raft made of woven rushes, accompanied by 4 high-ranking nobles, and float slowly, silently, into the very center of the lake. As the sun finally broke over the surrounding peaks, bathing the valley in light, the Golden Man would dive into the dark, cold depths, washing the gold from his skin as a sacred offering to the gods who dwelt in the waters below. All around him, the people gathered on the shore would cast emeralds and intricate golden ornaments into the water, watching as their treasures disappeared into the deep silt, returning the stolen light of the sun to the silent heart of the earth. It was a ritual of divine balance, a moment of profound spiritual connection that had been performed for generations in the quiet, protected sanctuary of the mountains. But when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, they did not possess the eyes to see a sacred ritual. They possessed only the hunger to see a vault. Their ears, tuned only to the siren song of wealth, power, and European conquest, heard the whispered name of El Dorado and suffered a violent, collective transformation of the soul. They took the image of a single man and magnified him into a sprawling, impossible kingdom. They took a handful of golden offerings and imagined an entire empire where the very buildings were forged of solid gold, and the dust of the streets was worth more than the crowns of the old world. The misunderstanding was absolute, tragic, and irreversible. In the fevered European imagination, El Dorado morphed from a spiritual ceremony of release into a physical destination of possession, a shimmering mirage of paradise that was always just over the next ridge, always hidden behind the next thick curtain of emerald green. As you listen to the rhythmic pulse of this story, imagine the low, mournful sound of the wind moving through the Colombian, Highlands, a sigh that travels through the tall, swaying grass and the stunted ancient trees of the paramo. The air up here is cool, thin, and remarkably pure, a place of profound silence where the only movement is the slow drifting of the white clouds against a deep blue sky. There is a peace in this landscape, a sense of ancient permanence that remains entirely untouched by the frantic, desperate desires of men. The lake remains as it has always been, a dark, silent eye looking up at the heavens, holding its secrets beneath layers of heavy mud and centuries of legend. The gold is still there, perhaps, buried so deep in the darkness that it has become part of the earth itself, but it no longer shines for the eyes of the living. To the Spanish mind, this was not a place of worship, but a puzzle to be solved, a lock to be picked. They began to hear stories of other lands, further away, where the gold was so plentiful that even the common people wore it as simple decoration. These stories were often told by indigenous groups who were desperate to lead the violent strangers away from their own villages, pointing them deeper into the unknown with vague promises of just a bit further. Every map drawn in the candlelit tents of the conquistadors became a web of hope and fabrication, placing the fabled city of Manoa, or the kingdom of gold, in the blank spaces of the continent. They traded the cold logic of the old world for a new kind of religion, the religion of the search, where the goal was not salvation, but the ultimate prize hidden in the green shadows. This tragic misunderstanding, this fatal translation of a soul's devotion into a merchant's greed, became the broken compass that pointed only toward disaster. It ignited a fever in the blood of the explorers that no amount of cold reason could ever hope to cool. They turned their backs on the quiet beauty of the highlands and the sacred, still lakes, driven by the seductive promise of a glittering lie. This singular, blinding obsession would soon drive thousands of men away from the life-giving light of the sun and into the deepest, darkest, and most unforgiving jungles on the face of the earth. They were entering a place where the trees grow so thick they swallow the very day, and where the only thing that glitters is the cold eye of a predator watching from the deep shadows. The dream they followed was made of gold, but the reality they found was a suffocating labyrinth of emerald green, a place where the search for a myth would demand a price that few were truly prepared to pay, and where the jungle would eventually claim everything they had brought with them. Feel the humidity beginning to rise in the air, the scent of wood smoke from the high mountain fires fading as the heavy smell of rain, damp moss and decaying leaves takes its place. We are leaving the crisp mountain air behind, descending into the canopy where the sun is only a distant memory, and where the legend of El Dorado begins to take on its most dangerous and haunting form. The golden man of the lake is gone, and in his place a golden city begins to shimmer in the mind, a ghost that leads men deeper into the silence of the trees, toward a horizon that never arrives. The quiet prayers of the Muisca are drowned out by the sound of hacking blades and the heavy, labored breathing of men who have forgotten how to rest. In this green twilight, the only thing that remains certain is the search itself, an endless journey into the heart of a dream that is rapidly becoming a nightmare. The golden dream, which once felt so bright and sacred in the cool, thin air of the high Andes, began to undergo a slow, suffocating transformation as it descended into the dark, tangled heart of the Amazon basin. It was no longer a ritual of light. It had become a fever of the blood. In the year 1541, a massive and ambitious expedition led by Gonzalo Pizarro set out from the city of Quito, fueled by whispered rumors of vast cinnamon forests and hidden cities of solid gold, waiting just beyond the next jagged mountain peak. Pizarro brought with him a small army of over 300 Spanish soldiers, hundreds of indigenous porters, and a collection of horses, a grand, clanking procession of human ambition, marching toward a shimmering, elusive mirage. But as they descended from the clouds and entered the lowlands, the open sky was abruptly replaced by a heavy emerald canopy that swallowed the sun, and the golden promise began to dissolve into a relentless reality of mud, biting insects, and absolute, bone-deep exhaustion. Visualize these men, clad in heavy iron plate armor, designed for the dry, open battlefields of Europe, now struggling through a lightless labyrinth of strangling vines and waist-deep black swamps where the rain never truly stopped. The humidity was not just weather, it was a physical weight, a wet shroud that rusted their breastplates until they turned a dull orange-brown and rotted the very leather of their boots, until every step became a labor of pure, agonizing will. Disease and starvation began to claim the expedition, one by one, turning the proud march into a desperate, silent crawl through the undergrowth. Desperate for any sign of food or escape, Pizarro sent a smaller party ahead led by Francisco de Orellana to forage down the winding river. Orellana and his small band of men floated deeper and deeper into the green unknown, eventually finding the current too powerful and the jungle too thick to ever return upstream to rejoin their command. By accident, born of sheer desperation and the pull of the water, they became the first Europeans to navigate the entire staggering length of the Amazon River. They passed through vast, strange civilizations and saw cities that seemed to vibrate with life, yet they found not a single grain of the fabled, heavy gold of El Dorado. As the decades drifted by like the slow-moving silt of the river, the fever did not break. It simply moved from one obsessed dreamer to the next. The golden obsession eventually crossed the vast Atlantic to the English court, taking a firm hold of the brilliant, theatrical, and deeply ambitious Sir Walter Raleigh. A favorite of Queen Elizabeth, Raleigh was a man made of poetry and iron, a visionary who convinced himself that the golden city of Manoa in the kingdom of Guyana was his specific destiny to claim for England. He sailed to the mouth of the Orinoco River, eventually publishing accounts that sparkled with imaginative, seductive details of a rich empire that lay just beyond the next horizon. But the myth of El Dorado proved to be a cruel and indifferent master. In his final tragic expedition in 1617, Raleigh's grand dreams were finally undone by a violent, chaotic skirmish that cost him the life of his beloved son. What? He returned to the grey shores of England, empty-handed, broken-hearted, and grieving, only to face the cold edge of the executioner's blade, a man utterly consumed and discarded by the very legend he had helped to polish for the world. Imagine now the profound rhythmic silence that follows the departure of these failed and forgotten explorers. The jungle, vast, ancient, and entirely indifferent to the titles of men, does not remember their names or their desperate quests. It slowly and rhythmically reclaims the tiny spaces they tried to carve out of the green walls. Visualize the thick emerald vines twisting slowly around discarded iron helmets, and the soft green moss growing over the surfaces of rusted swords that were once symbols of pride. The heavy tropical rains wash away the silent footprints of the thousands of men who wandered into this green twilight and never emerged. There is a strange, soothing peace in this act of reclamation, a sense of the earth breathing deeply as it heals the scars left by human grief. The trees grow taller, their roots anchoring into the bones of the past, until the memory of the search is buried beneath infinite layers of damp leaves and the slow passage of time. The jungle did not guard a city of gold. It guarded a story that reflected the deepest, most insatiable hungers of the human heart. El Dorado was never found, because it was never a physical place to be marked on a map. It was a broken compass pointing toward the impossible, a dream that shimmered brighter the further one moved into the dark. As the emerald shadows of the Amazon finally begin to recede in your mind, the air around you starts to cool and clear once more. The heavy, damp scent of the rainforest floor is replaced by the smell of salt and sun-warmed stone. We are leaving behind the humid, desperate fever of the jungle and the rusted relics of obsession, moving toward a world characterized by balance, symmetry, and white marble. We are traveling back across the deep blue sea to a landscape of ancient olive groves and pale stone, where we find a different kind of ritual, one etched not in the ephemeral dust of gold, but in the timeless, enduring grace of human excellence and the quiet gaze of the gods. Here, in the cradle of another world, the air is crisp, the light is clear, and the race is run not for gold, but for the simple honor of a wreath of leaves. The journey of the soul often requires these long, shadowed passages through the wilderness before it can return to the clarity of the sun. The Amazon remains behind us now, a vast and breathing green lung, its secrets safe beneath the canopy, untroubled by the ghosts of Pizarro or Raleigh. Their heavy armor has long since dissolved into the soil, feeding the very roots of the trees they sought to conquer. As you drift further into the stillness, feel the transition from the chaotic, reaching vines to the clean, straight lines of a temple's columns. The humidity of the forest gives way to a gentle Mediterranean breeze, carrying the scent of wild thyme and sea salt. You are moving from the dream of possession to the dream of being, where the only prize is the perfection of the moment itself. Your breathing slows, matching the steady rhythm of the waves hitting the shore of a distant, sacred peninsula. The fever has finally broken, and in its place is a cool, white light that promises a different kind of treasure. The treasure of a quiet mind and a body finally at rest in the sanctuary of the ancient world. The heavy, humid air of the Amazonian jungle has finally cleared, drifting away like a fading fever dream, replaced now by a crisp, salt-scented breeze that carries the pure, timeless spirit of a completely different age. We move now through the mist of time to the year 776 BC. A sacred Emerald Valley nestled in the heart of ancient Greece, known as Olympia. Here, there are no golden cities to chase through the shadows, and no treacherous, suffocating swamps to navigate. Instead, there is a sanctuary of brilliant white marble, shaded by the silver-green leaves of ancient olive trees and governed by a profound, unshakable sense of divine reverence. The Greeks did not gather in this holy place for the sake of conquest, territorial expansion, or material profit. They came from every scattered city-state to honor Zeus, the majestic king of the gods, through a spectacular display of physical and spiritual excellence. In this sacred space, the frantic, discordant noise of the outside world falls silent, replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of a civilization that sought the ultimate beauty in the perfect balance of the human body and the eternal soul. In a land that was often fractured by bitter, long-standing rivalries and seemingly endless cycles of warfare, the Olympic Games offered a recurring miracle of unity. Before the first contest could ever begin, heralds were sent to every distant corner of the Greek world to announce the Ikacheria, the sacred truce. This was not a mere suggestion of peace or a temporary political agreement. It was a binding, holy command issued by the gods themselves. For a period of 1 to 3 months, all weapons were laid down, and all soldiers transformed into peaceful spectators or disciplined participants. Great armies paused their marches in mid-stride, and even the most hostile of borders were thrown open, allowing athletes, priests, and travelers to move freely through the rugged landscape without a flicker of fear. The truce was a profound reminder that even in a world so often ruled by conflict, there are sacred moments where we must stop, breathe deeply, and show respect for something far greater than our own fleeting ambitions. Under the vast, watchful gaze of a massive statue of Zeus, the Greeks remembered they were one single people, bound together by a shared language, shared myths, and a shared ancient devotion to the divine. As the soft morning sun warms the pale stone of the stadium, the athletes step forward, deliberately shedding every physical marker of their earthly status, wealth, or origin. In ancient Olympia, men competed in what was known as heroic nudity, standing before the gods and their fellow citizens in a state of total, unapologetic transparency. To the ancient Greeks, the unclothed body was never a source of shame or indecency. It was a radiant reflection of inner virtue made visible to the world, a living, breathing sculpture of discipline, symmetry, and strength. In the arena, there were no colorful uniforms to hide behind, no family crests to boast of, and no military ranks to claim. There was only the raw, honest effort of the human form as it reached toward its highest possible potential. These men were not racing for piles of gold or silver coins. They were striving for the singular immortal honor of a simple olive wreath, a crown of wild leaves cut from a holy tree near the temple that promised a glory that would never fade from the songs of poets. The atmosphere within the stadium is one of deep, focused, and rhythmic calm. Close your eyes now and imagine the rich, golden scent of pure olive oil as the athletes carefully anoint their skin, their muscles glistening under the bright Mediterranean sun. There is the soft, repetitive, and grounding sound of bare feet hitting the hard, packed earth of the track, a steady cadence that seems to echo the very heartbeat of the valley. You can hear the low, hushed murmur of the vast crowd, a sound like distant waves, and the rhythmic chime of a ritual bell echoing through the columns of the temples. Every movement in this sacred space is deliberate. Every breath taken by the athletes is deep, centered, and full of purpose. The struggle for victory is intense, yet it is perfectly contained within a framework of absolute divine respect and traditional order. Here, in the long, cool shadow of the great temple of Zeus, you are reminded that the truest and most enduring form of excellence, the concept they called arete, is found in the quiet, steady mastery of oneself. The Stadium of Zeus is a place of profound rest for the mind, a sanctuary where the spirit is allowed to stand tall, unburdened by the worries of the future or the regrets of the past. As the intense heat of the afternoon begins to soften into a long amber twilight, the echoes of the sprint and the cheers of the crowd begin to fade into the evening air. The athletes will eventually return to their distant cities as heroes, their names etched forever into the living memory of their people. But the deep, foundational peace of Olympia remains behind. It is a stillness that has survived the rise and fall of empires, a quiet power that speaks of human unity and the enduring grace of the striving spirit. The white stone of the ancient temples catches the very last light of the sun, glowing with a soft ethereal radiance that promises a night of deep, safe, and undisturbed sleep. But as the sacred flame of Olympia burns low, and the shadows of the olive trees stretch across the silver grass, we find ourselves looking toward the distant horizon, toward the edge of the blue sea, where the water meets the deepening sky. The piece of the stadium is a firm foundation, but there are other ancient wonders yet to explore, monuments that reached even higher toward the heaven, born of the same desire for excellence. From the silent, dust-covered tracks of the Peloponnese, we turn our gaze toward the vibrant, wealthy harbor of the island of Rhodes. There, standing tall over the white-capped waves, a god of bronze is waiting to welcome the very first light of the dawn, a towering, magnificent sentinel of light that watched over the ancient world long after the games had ended. We leave the quiet olive groves behind, drifting slowly on the warm tide toward a harbor where the bronze skin of a fallen titan still reflects the enduring warmth of the sun. Leaving the quiet, dust-moated tracks of the Peloponnese behind, we drift now on a warm, rhythmic Mediterranean tide toward the vibrant and wealthy harbor of the island of Rhodes. The air here is noticeably different, charged with the refreshing energy of the sea, carrying the faint metallic scent of sun-warmed bronze and the fine salt spray that mist the harbor walls. This tale does not begin with the delicate, practiced touch of an artist's brush or the quiet, prayerful peace of a temple. It begins with the deafening, chaotic roar of ancient war and a city that simply, stubbornly refused to fall. In the year 305 BCE, the island of Rhodes found itself trapped in a brutal, year-long siege by the massive Macedonian army, a force led by Demetrius the Besieger, who brought with him a terrifying mobile fortress, 9 stories high, and an array of catastrophic war machines designed to shatter stone and spirit alike. Yet, through sheer unyielding resilience and a tactical wit that outmatched their enemies, the Rhodians held their ground until the siege finally collapsed. Demetrius withdrew in humiliation, leaving behind a literal mountain of abandoned siege equipment, towering structures of wood, iron, and thousands upon thousands of pounds of heavy, high-quality bronze. To commemorate this improbable, hard-won victory and to honor their eternal patron deity, Helios, the sun god, the people of Rhodes made a decision that would stun and inspire the ancient world for centuries to come. They would not simply melt down the enemy's abandoned weapons to replenish their treasury or forge new swords. They would reforge them into a monument of absolute, towering defiance. They commissioned the master sculptor Charis of Lindos to create a figure so immense, so technologically daring, that it would redefine the very limits of human engineering and artistic ambition. Charis, a man who understood the profound language of proportion and the heavy weight of civic pride, began the monumental task of constructing a 100-foot-tall image of the sun god, Helios. For 12 long, sun-drenched years, the harbor was filled with the rhythmic, steady sound of hammers against metal and the low hum of furnaces as the statue slowly, majestically rose from the earth like a living thing. The construction process was a feat of staggering complexity and patience. Thousands of workers toiled under the blazing Mediterranean sun, carefully shaping individual bronze plates and fitting them with surgical precision over a massive internal skeleton made of iron and heavy stone. This was the ultimate poetic reveal of the Rhodians' indomitable spirit. The Colossus was a symbol of total resilience, built entirely from the very bronze that had been specifically meant to destroy their city wall. What was once a direct threat was now a silent, golden guardian. What was once a weapon of destruction was now a masterpiece of enduring peace. As each new section was cast and hoisted into place using vast, winding earthen ramps, the figure of Helios began to dominate the skyline, a bronze titan, visible to sailors for miles before they ever touched the shore. Close your eyes now and visualize the Colossus as it stood in its completed, radiant glory. Helios is depicted as a serene, youthful figure, his face idealized and perfectly calm, looking out with an eternal gaze across the endless, deep blue horizon of the sea. On his head, he wears a magnificent crown of radiating spikes, echoing the divine, life-giving rays of the sun itself. There is a profound, soothing beauty in the way the very first light of the dawn hits the statue's bronze skin, painting the entire harbor in a soft, shimmering golden glow that feels almost warm to the touch. The sunlight dances across the metallic surface, reflecting off the gently moving waves and casting a long, protective shadow over the merchants, the sailors, and the travelers as they navigate the busy, salt-scented waters below. Standing beneath the immense weight of his shadow, one feels a sense of immense, rhythmic stability. A deep-seated belief that some things, once forged in the fires of adversity and built with the intent of gratitude, might truly last forever. The Colossus became far more than just a statue. It became the very heartbeat and identity of Rhodes, a beacon of cultural pride that was minted onto their silver coins and celebrated in the breath-bound verses of every traveling poet who entered the gates. It stood as a universal, unwavering emblem of hope, a reminder to all who sailed past that human strength could be sculpted from the depths of suffering, and that true beauty could be found even in the shattered relics of conflict. The statue's silent presence offered a quiet, enduring promise to every citizen of the city, a sky-bound vow that as long as the sun rose to touch the polished bronze brow of Helios, the island would remain unshaken, prosperous, and free. But as you drift further and further into the absolute stillness of the evening, the rhythmic, repetitive sound of the waves against the stone begins to slow, and the amber light of the setting sun starts to fade into a deeper, cooler purple. History, much like the tide of the sea, is never truly static. It is a cycle of building and returning. Even the most magnificent of wonders, forged from the strongest iron and the thickest, most resilient bronze, must eventually bow to the unpredictable, primal power of the trembling earth. The deep stability we felt beneath the feet of the feet. Bronze Titan begins to soften, and the air grows heavy with the scent of approaching rain and the quiet of the night. We prepare to leave the gleaming, golden harbor of Rhodes behind, moving toward the very final chapter of this long, historical journey, where the bronze gives way to the softness of memory, and the great statue finally returns to the eternal silence from which it was first born. The earth beneath our feet begins to tremble, ever so slightly, as the light of the sun god prepares to dim, and the world falls into a long-awaited rest. In the quiet, heavy year 226 BC, just over half a century after the magnificent sun god was first raised to the endless Greek sky, the very ground beneath the island of Rhodes began to tremble with a deep, primal groan that seemed to rise from the center of the earth. Without warning, a massive earthquake struck the harbor, a blind, impartial force of nature that cared nothing for the brilliance of human engineering, the weight of bronze, or the sacred ancient vows of a city. As the massive harbor walls shuddered and the great temples cracked open like dry parchment, the mighty Colossus, the towering pride of the ancient world, finally snapped at its knees and began its slow, heavy, and inevitable descent toward the earth. It did not simply tip over like a felled tree. It broke piece by massive piece, twisting as it descended, until the bronze head that had once gazed proudly at the rising sun lay face down in the gray dust of the harbor. The golden guardian of the waves had fallen, brought low by the shivering of the world, reminding all of humanity that even the most magnificent of wonders have a quiet, definitive limit to their time on this earth. Yet, even in its profound and heavy ruin, the Colossus of Rhodes refused to be forgotten by the soul of history. For the next 800 years, the shattered, colossal remains of the bronze Titan lay scattered across the sacred ground of the harbor. And in that long legendary silence, it remained a marvel to every single traveler who passed through the island's gates. The ancient historian Strabo once wrote of the fallen god with a sense of deep, lingering awe, describing bronze fingers that were thicker than a man's torso and hollow, broken limbs that resembled great, empty towers of metal. There was a haunting, quiet, and deeply soothing beauty in the wreckage, a sense of a sleeping giant resting forever beneath the warmth of the Mediterranean sun. The Rhodians, heeding a chilling and solemn warning from the Oracle of Delphi, chose never to lift the great statue again, believing that to rebuild the Titan would be to provoke the further, uncontrollable wrath of the god. And so, the bronze lay in the soft grass for centuries, a fallen wonder that spoke more loudly of human resilience and the grace of impermanence in its brokenness than it ever had in the days of its perfection. The final, quiet reveal of the Colossus's physical journey came long after the ancient world had faded into a blue mist of memory. In the year 654 CE, centuries after the great quake had first brought the Titan down, an invading army saw the vast, scattered ruins not as a sacred memory of a lost age, but as a simple source of raw, practical material. The legendary fragments were finally broken down, melted away from the soil of Rhodes, and sold to a merchant who carried the bronze into the deep desert on the swaying backs of 900 camels. In that silent moment, the physical Titan vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only the echoing, indestructible power of a legend. The statue that had once welcomed every weary ship to the harbor now existed only in the spoken words of poets and the fading, amber ink of old maps, a ghost of human greatness that refused to truly disappear from the collective heart of the world. Now, as the long story of the bronze god finally reaches its end, feel the long, velvet shadows of history stretching across the vastness of time, becoming soft, warm, and blurred at the very edges of your mind. The frantic, iron-willed ambitions of Catherine in the north, the humid, fevered dreams of El Dorado in the jungle, and the steady, rhythmic races of the Olympic Valley have all settled into a deep, foundational silence. But remember, this silence is not an end. It is a bridge. Even as this story dissolves, another is always waiting to begin in the quiet corridors of the past. The gods are quiet now. Their ancient temples return to the soft earth, but their whispers still travel on the wind, looking for a place to rest in the next dream you choose to inhabit. There is a profound and lasting peace in the realization that while the bronze may fall and the gold may eventually vanish, the stories themselves remain a gentle, steady, and lingering hum that continues even after the voice fades. The world around you is perfectly still, the air is cool and clean, and the heavy, ancient weight of history has been laid down at last, leaving you light, unburdened, and entirely safe. You are drifting now, moving away from the harbor of Rhodes and toward an even deeper, darker sea, where new wonders are waiting to be whispered. The torch of this journey is flickering out, but the warmth of the narrative stays with you, guiding you into the softest part of the night. The journey is over for now, but the gates of history are never truly closed. They remain slightly ajar, waiting for your return when the sun sets again. For now, there is only the silence, the breath, and the infinite space of a quiet mind. Every empire has finally found its peace, and every weary explorer has finally come home. You are safe. You are home. Sleep well. Sleep until the next story finds you. Sleep well.